discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about massive missile and drone strike that took place during the previous night. The Russians attacked almost the entire territory of Ukraine, especially the city of Kiev and the western part of Ukraine. The Ukrainians from their side were trying to bring down Russian missiles and drones, but Ukraine air defense shown very poor results. According to information we have, the Russian armed forces launched around 407 drones and 44 missiles over Ukraine overnight. The Russian armed forces attacked mostly from the northern regions, and the entire mass of drones was moving in a creeping offensive towards the western regions. Up to 30 missiles and up to 200 drones were destroyed, so less than 50% of air units. And of course, during the previous night, we got lots of pictures, lots of videos, lots of different data that show us the results of Russian attack. For example, in this article, we can see huge fire after striking Kiev, and according to Ukrainian sources, likely hit by a thermal power plant. A fire broke out after a drone strike, and power outages began in the capital of Ukraine. So these are the consequences of Russian attack, and as you can see, the Russians, probably for the first time for a very long period of time, attack Ukraine power facilities, which is obviously not very good piece of news for the Ukrainians. So in this short video, we can see blurred video, we can see several explosions on the territory of the city of Kiev during the previous night, and here we can see the consequence of attack. Very huge fire after striking Kiev. But this is not the most important video that we got today from the city of Kiev. Probably this video is the most important one. And in this video, we can see how Ukrainians during the previous night were trying to bring down Russian missiles with Patriot air defense system. At least 4 missiles were launched by the Ukrainians with the purpose to bring down Russian Iskander missiles that were heading towards the city of Kiev. But this video shows that the Ukrainians missed the target. 4 missiles didn't do anything with the Russians' Iskander missiles. And in the final part of this video, we can see how Russian Iskander missile get the Ukrainian target and most likely attacked the position of Ukraine Patriot air defense system. So this is the most important video. We see that Ukrainians have huge problems with air defense and they can't do anything with this. And we know that currently there are very heavy problems, big problems between Ukraine and the United States of America regarding supply and support of Ukraine with weapons and arms.
Velkommen til Andersen og Martini. I dag skal vi ud og køre i lidt af et ikon inden for bilverden, en Mini Cooper SE.
But the most interesting and the most important videos are coming not from the city of Kiev. It's clear with the city of Kiev. The most interesting updates are coming from the western part of Ukraine, because probably it's the first time when the Russians attack the western part of Ukraine massively. During the previous night, we got lots of videos, for example, from the city of Ternopil, and here we can see very heavy explosion on the territory of the settlement this morning. So as you can see, it's not night, it is already morning in the city of Chernobyl, and we see very heavy explosion. But the thing is that we got videos from the city of Chernobyl with heavy explosions not just during the morning but also during the night, which means that the Russians were bombing and attacking the settlement over the entire night, and the Russians sent probably dozens of missiles and drones in this area, and as a result of all these attacks, most likely lots of military facilities were damaged and destroyed, or industrial facilities were damaged and destroyed that Ukrainians used to produce drones or arms for Ukraine. So, and during this morning we got lots of videos where we can see short videos where we can see consequences of Russian attacks. Several warehouses were destroyed, several ammo depots were destroyed, and so on. And in these videos you can see there was a secondary detonation and secondary explosion after another Russian attack. So the settlement of Ternopil in the western part of Ukraine is not the only settlement that was attacked by the Russians. Another city that was basically attacked by the Russians is the city of Lutsk, and when talking about this area we got probably the most interesting video. In this video, we can see the first Iskander or cruise missile strike on the territory of the city. A few seconds later, we got another strike almost in the same area with another ballistic or cruise missiles. And then 3 or 4 seconds later, we got another Iskander strike or strike with cruise missiles. So the most important thing that the Russians faced no barriers when they were attacking the western part of Ukraine. And then 4 missile strikes, so 4 strikes in a row without any problems. Something big probably huge was destroyed as a result of this attack. And this is the video where we can see Russian missiles flying in the western part of Ukraine. And as you can see, the Russian missiles were improved with additional, let's say, barriers, with additional protection, with the purpose to distract attention of Ukraine air defense. But saying the truth, I'm not even sure whether the Ukrainians have air defense in the western part of Ukraine or not. And the most important thing, that's for the first time probably since 2024 we haven't received anything that, for example, Polish air forces were forced to raise their F-16s or other types of aircrafts in the airspace of Poland, with the purpose to be 100% sure that they can secure the sky of Poland and not to allow Russian missiles to enter the territory of Poland. So as you can see, Polish air forces decided not to do this. And you know that there are currently very huge problems between Poland and Ukraine regarding some dates of the Second World War. Today, Poland made several official announcements regarding the territories of the western part of Ukraine, or as Polish authorities reported, the eastern territories of the Second Polish Republic. So there is a very huge problems between them. So we believe that this is the reason why Poland decided not to raise aircrafts this time. Anyway, this is the first day of Russia's strike. Most likely the Russians will continue because there are offensive operations along the entire line of combat contact, and obviously the Russians will attack more with the purpose to destroy as many as possible ammo depots, warehouses, with the purpose to allow their forces to move faster and without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground, and first let's discuss the situation in the Sumy region, where the Russians continue their offensive. And this is the first morning probably during the previous 5 or 6 days when we haven't received anything about additional progress on the ground in the direction of the city of Sumy. And instead of additional progress, we got lots of videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions along the second defense belt. So this is the situation. The Russians managed to get the second defense belt almost along the entire line of combat contact in the Sumy direction. There are several exceptions when talking about the settlement of Yunakivo. There are still very heavy clashes, so we believe that the Russians didn't move further in the southern direction towards the village of Khotin, or in the western direction towards the settlement of Yastrubovka, because the Russians are trying to maintain the lines, to shorten them, and to finish the battle for the central and the eastern flanks of the Sumy offensive. We are talking about the villages of Novonikolaevka, Varachino, Yablunovka, and Yunakievka. Several villages, as you can see, we have already colored in the area of contested zone. And as for the village of Yunakievka, we see that Ukrainians still have strong control with this territory. So first the Russians will try to maintain this territory, and then the Russians will continue moving further. But telling the truth, we expect that the Russians would continue moving further in the western direction towards the village of Yastrubina, with the purpose to attack Ukrainians in the area of Tsotkino from behind. Because here the situation remains tense. Today we got additional videos how Ukrainians basically are reducing the settlement of Tsotkino till ruins, and we see that Ukrainians are using all type of calibers they have. They don't have a lot of weapons, but they have enough of weapons just to reduce the settlement and to take under control this area. So there are very heavy clashes, and I'll remind that according to information we have, the Russians were encircled by the Ukrainians in this area from different directions. The main supply lines were cut by the Ukrainians, so the situation here is very difficult, and the Ukrainians continue their offensive operation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction, more precisely in the southern Kupiansk or the Liman direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation with the purpose to encircle the settlement of Zelena Dolina from the north and from the south. According to information we have, during the previous days, the Russians were focused and were tasked to take this territory under complete control, and during the previous days the Russians managed basically to outflank the village of Zelena Dolina from the south, from the southwest, from the north, and from the northwest. The Ukrainians were caught in cauldron in this area, and now the Russians were, during the previous days, the Russians were trying, or hours, were trying to tighten the news around this area. And today, the Ukrainians from the 60th Mechanized Brigade published this video, where we can see how Ukrainians were FPV droning and attacking Russians around the village of Zelena Dolina with FPV drones. The Ukrainians dealt lots of damage to the Russian units that were attacking the settlement, but this video also allowed us to adjust the map in the Russian favor. So this is the situation by the morning of the 6th of June of 2025. Now let's take a look at the situation by the end of the 5th of June. And for example, this is the situation by the end of the 5th of June. So as you can see, the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to take under complete control these territories, these tree lines, these fields, and the south flank the settlement of Kolodizy from the north. So this is very important progress on the ground. We still have huge gap between geolocated positions and contested area, but we see that at the same time the Russians are trying to shorten this gap and to get as close as possible to the settlement of Shandrigalova.
Jeg hedder Trine Terkelsen, og jeg synes, at du skal gå ind og høre playlisten Godnatsange. Der har jeg nogle af mine fortolkninger liggende, og
Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction, where we see that Ukrainian defense is collapsing. Ukrainian defense is collapsing, the Russians are advancing, and the Russians are getting closer and closer to the city of Konstantinovka from many directions. Probably the most important and updates we got from the Torietsk area, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly in these fields. Just yesterday, the Russians secured the territory around these lakes and reservoirs, and today we got reports that the Russians are about to establish complete control over these territories. According to information we have, the Russians are at the final stage of the battle for the south and the Lviv and for the area of the railway station. In this video, we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian forces in their last positions on the territory of the railway station with artillery, and Ukrainians from their side were attacking the Russians with FPV drones in the most northwestern part of the settlement. So now we see that most likely the Ukrainians were caught in cauldron or were encircled not just on the territory of the northern part of the southern Lvivka, but also on the territory of this company's stronghold. So these trenches and fortifications were captured, were encircled by the Russians by several maneuvers. The Russians improved their positions, as you can see, from the settlement from the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal along this tree line in the western direction, and the Russians managed to improve their positions along the railways on the territory of the southern Lvivka. Now Ukrainians, as you can see, have just one road for evacuation. We're talking about these tree lines, but we see that the news is tightening, and probably 2 more days and Ukrainians will lose their possibilities to evacuate and to escape this cauldron. So we expect that in the very near future the Russians would be able to clear this territory to maintain the lines and to continue offensive operation further in the northern direction, so along the railways in the direction of Alexandra Shultine. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation along tree lines from Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal in the direction of the north and the Lvivka from the southeast and from the east. So we see that the situation, the Russians are very focused in this area, and obviously the Russians are tasked to shorten this territory, to shorten the lines between the city of Chasiv Yar and the city of Toretsk along this red line. This is exactly what the Russians are doing right now, and most likely it will take them up to 3-4 weeks to finish this battle. Now let's talk about the Kliban-Byksky pockets. We still haven't received anything from the eastern flank, from the settlements of Kliban-Byk, Katerinovka, Sherbinovka, Novospaska, the territories along the railways and the river of Krivoy Torets, but at the same time the Russians continue their offensive operation along the western flank of the Kliban-Byksky pockets. During the previous nights, as you can see, the Russians improved their positions once again in the area of fields to the southwest of Alexander Kalinova and Yablunovka. We are talking about these territories, and the Russians another day in a row improved their positions on the western part of the settlement of Yablunovka. So let's compare the map for better understanding. This is the situation by the beginning of the 6th of June of 2025. Let's take a look at the map, how it looked like by the end of the 5th of June. Just yesterday we got reports that the Russians improved their positions in the western part of Yablunovka, and today we got additional changes on the ground on the field. So the Russians are about to finish the battle for the entire western flank, and the Russians are about to answer the central flank of the Kliban-Byksky pocket and to finish the battle for this pocket completely with the final task to encircle the Ukrainians on the territory of the eastern flank. So the situation for the Ukrainians in this direction remains tense. When talking about N32 road, after a very long operational pause, the Russians resumed their activities. First of all, the Russians began offensive operation or improving their positions in the vicinity of Popov Yar and these farms. Furthermore, according to information we have today, the Russians, by the morning of the 6th of June of 2025, the Russians secured up to 50% of strongholds in this dense network of the fortifications between Elizavetovka, Malinovka and Mirolubovka. This information during the previous nights was confirmed by the pro-Ukrainian resource, by pro-Russian and by neutral resources. For pro-Ukrainian resources, they haven't confirmed anything like this. So the Russians just won, probably several trenches, several strongholds remains for the Russians, and then the Russians most likely will take short pause, and then they will continue with the purpose to attack Novoekonomichne and Mykolaiivka. Once again, if the Russians are able to answer the settlement of Novoekonomichne, this is going to be the beginning of complete disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine, not just in the Pokrovsk agglomeration, but probably in the entire Donbas direction. By entering the settlement of Novoekonomichne, the Russians will face no barriers and no problems to establish complete control over this entire pocket, and this is going to be a huge disaster for the Ukrainians, because this is already something like a half encirclement of the Pokrovsk agglomeration and semi-encirclement of the Konstantinovka agglomeration. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. Just yesterday we were talking about the settlements of Kamar and Fyodorovka, and we made suggestion that most likely the Russians probably began offensive operation in this area, and the Russians almost established complete control over this territory. And today we got first geolocations and first video from this area that confirm almost complete control over this territory. The Russian sources published this video, and in this video we can see how Russian troops were moving from the south and the northern direction in the vicinity and inside of the settlement of Fyodorovka. So this episode with Russian soldiers was geolocated exactly in this point. So we see that the Russians managed to establish complete control for more than 90% of the settlement, and this video was published probably 10 hours ago. So we believe that probably right now, by the morning of the 6th of June, the entire village was captured and secured by the Russians. Most likely the Russians were not going to stop. They continue offensive operations further in the northern direction, and we expect the beginning of the battle for the settlement of Kamar during the next 72 hours. And most likely the Russians will attack the village of Kamar from the south and from the southwest, and of course the Russians will try to answer the village from the southeast. At least this information was confirmed by several neutral mappers, that the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the settlement of Kamar to the minimal value. So the battle for Kamar is about to be started. Another important update is coming from the southern parts, from the Guliai-Polye direction. If you remember, yesterday we got too many videos from the Zaporozhye direction, and I pointed your attention that we haven't received anything like this since the beginning of the special military operation. Guliai-Polye was under very heavy fire from different directions, from different calibers. The Russians basically were reducing this settlement to ruins, and yesterday we made the probably projection that most likely the Russians were planning to attack, and today, this morning on the 6th of June of 2025, we started receiving first reports and first updates that indeed the Russians began offensive operation in the Guliai-Polye direction. But the Russians attacked not the city of Guliai-Polye itself. The Russians, according to information we have, began their offensive operation in the direction of Malinovka. This is the village to the east of the settlement of Guliai-Polye. And this information this morning was confirmed by pro-Russian resources and by pro-Ukrainian sources by Deep State. The Russian armed forces launched an offensive on Malinovka. So as for now, there are still very heavy clashes on the outskirts, but we need to understand that the purpose of Russian attack in Malinovka not to attack the city of Guliai-Polye itself from the east. Now the Russians will try to attack the settlement of Uspenovka. This is the key stronghold in this area. This is the village we are talking about. This is probably 3 villages at the same place. This is the northeastern flank of the settlement of Guliai-Polye. And we expect that the Russians will try to attack this settlement from the east, using these routes of attack from the villages of Zeleno-Polye, Novopol, Ternopol. And now the Russians began another offensive to attack the same settlement from the south. If the Russians are able to establish complete control over the village of Uspenovka and to force Ukrainians to fall back further in the direction of Guliai-Polye, this is going to be already something like a semi-encirclement of this city, and the Russians will continue with the purpose to establish complete control over this territory. The situation for the Ukrainians here is becoming also very, very difficult and complicated. And that's it for the short video on military